In October of 2011, the First Central Bank of Ames County sold Silas Croft's life for $600. Or, to be more precise, they sold the contents of his workshop at 142 Tinker Creek Road. The two, for Silas, were the same thing. The auction took place on a Saturday, under a sky the color of washed-out denim. It was cold for October, with a wind that carried the smell of dying leaves and diesel exhaust from generators powering the auctioneer's sound system. Silas was there. He stood at the back of the crowd of about 70 people, leaning against the fender of a neighbor's Ford F-150, his arms crossed over his thin chest. He was 78 years old, had been a Bowyer for 62 of those years, and was known for two things: the uncanny accuracy of his yew longbows and a silence that could outlast any argument. He wore the same thing he wore every day: denim overalls over a gray flannel shirt, the cuffs worn to a soft fringe, and a pair of leather work boots, so old they looked like they had grown around his feet. He did not watch the auctioneer. He watched the door of the workshop, the one he had built with his father in 1953. It was a simple, single-story structure, 24 feet by 40 feet, clad in board and batten siding that had gone from pine yellow to silver gray over the decades. To the bank, it was an outbuilding, a depreciating asset on a foreclosed 1.7-acre parcel. To Silas, it was the whole world. Inside that building was a smell that no auction could sell. It was the scent of Osage orange, yew, and black locust shavings, of linseed oil and beeswax, of hot metal from the forge, and the faint, dusty sweetness of time itself. It was the smell of his father and his father's father. The Croft family had been working with wood on this same piece of land since 1889. They hadn't owned it then. They were tenant farmers. Silas's great-grandfather, Elias Croft, had bought the first 2 acres with money he saved selling hand-carved axe handles. The workshop was the center of that world. It wasn't a hobby shop. It was a place of production, but of a kind the modern world had forgotten. Silas made on average 12 bows a year. Each one took between 80 and 120 hours of labor. He worked from staves of wood he had seasoned himself, some of which had been drying in the rafters of that shop since his father was a young man. He knew the wood not by sight but by feel, by the sound it made when he tapped it, by the way it resisted the draw knife. This was a knowledge that could not be written down in a book or entered into a database. It lived in his hands. And now the contents of that life, that history, were being sold off as Lot 34. Let me tell you about the lathe, because the lathe was the heart of the workshop. It wasn't the most valuable item in terms of scrap metal, and it certainly wasn't the newest. It was a 1938 South Bend Model 9A, purchased secondhand by Silas's father, Abram Croft, in 1946 for $150, money he'd saved from his Army pay. It had a 4.5-foot bed and a 9-inch swing. When it arrived, it was caked in the grease and grime of a wartime machine shop, where it had likely turned out parts for aircraft or munitions. Abram spent 3 weeks disassembling it, cleaning every gear with kerosene, polishing every slide, repainting the cast iron body in the original South Bend gray. But he didn't just restore it. He began to modify it. Abram Croft was a bowyer, but he was also an inventor. He saw the lathe not just as a tool for turning metal or round stock, but as a machine for precisely shaping the complex, non-symmetrical tapers of a longbow stave. Over the next decade, he designed and built a series of jigs and fixtures for it that were unique in the world. There was a follow-up rest with a series of adjustable wooden cams that allowed him to turn a square stave into a perfectly tapered, bellied D-section, following the grain of the wood exactly. There was a specialized chuck with 4 independent, leather-padded jaws that could hold an irregular piece of yew without bruising the precious sapwood. He geared it down, swapping the motor for a slower, high-torque model from a washing machine, giving him the fine control he needed. When Silas took over the shop in the late 1950s, he continued the tradition. He added a custom indexing wheel with markings based on his own decades of experience, allowing him to make minute adjustments for the nocks and the handle riser. The lathe was no longer a South Bend 9A. It was the Croft Bow lathe. It was a physical library of 3 generations of accumulated knowledge. It had its own sounds. Silas could tell by the pitch of the hum if the belt was too tight. He knew the specific chatter it made when the cutting tool hit a pin knot in a piece of osage. The machine was a part of him, an extension of his own nervous system. When the bankman came, he had walked right past it, his eyes scanning for newer, more recognizable tools. The lathe sat in the corner, covered in a fine layer of sawdust, looking to the untrained eye like a piece of industrial junk. It was the quietest thing in the shop, and the most important, and it was about to be sold for its weight in scrap. The man from the bank was named Mark Jennings. He was 32 years old, had an MBA from the State University, and had been in asset liquidation for 4 years. He was known for his efficiency. He drove a silver Honda Accord that was always clean, and he carried a tablet computer on which he recorded every item, cross-referencing it with a database of recent auction prices for similar goods. He arrived at the workshop 2 weeks before the sale. He introduced himself to Silas with a firm, brief handshake. His hands were smooth. Mark saw a cluttered, poorly lit out building filled with obsolete equipment. He saw fire hazards and liabilities. His job was to convert physical clutter into digital cash as quickly as possible. He walked through the shop with his tablet, taking pictures and making notes. Silas followed him, a silent shadow. Mark pointed to a stack of wood in the corner. "What's this here? Firewood?" he asked. Silas looked at the wood. It was a pile of U-staves, some of them with tags his father had written in pencil. One was dated 1962. It had been seasoning for nearly 50 years, waiting for the right bough. It wasn't firewood, it was potential. It was patience made tangible. "It's you," Silas said. The word hung in the air, meaning nothing to the younger man. Mark typed scrap lumber, mixed hardwood into his tablet, and moved on. He stopped at the lathe. He ran a hand over the cold iron, leaving a streak in the dust. "This thing even run?" Silas nodded. "It runs." "Old South Bend," Mark said, reading the plate. He consulted his tablet. Not much demand for these old belt-driven models. The hobby guys want the new variable speed ones from China. "We'll be lucky to get 200 for it. Best to lump it in with the rest of the shop tools." He made a note. Lot 34. Contents of woodworking shop. Various hand and power tools. Scrap lumber. He was bundling a life's work into a single line item. Silas didn't argue. He understood that he and this young man were speaking different languages. Mark was speaking the language of markets, of liquidity, of fungible assets. Silas spoke the language of wood grain, of tillering, of patience. There was no translation. Mark asked, "Do you have an inventory? A list of what's here?" Silas looked around the room. He could have told him the story of every tool. The draw knife his grandfather had forged from a buggy spring. The Danish scraper plane he'd bought in 1971. The tillering stick marked with the draw weights of bows he'd made for men who were now long dead. That was the inventory. It was a story, but you couldn't put a story on an auction list. So he just shook his head. No, no list. Mark Jennings made a final note, his face a mask of professional sympathy. "We'll do our best to get a fair price for you, Mr. Croft." Silas Croft knew what kind of price he would get. It would be a price determined by men who saw a pile of old tools, not the 62 years of mastery it had taken to learn how to use them. Silas had a grandson, Leo. Leo was 24, a recent college graduate with a degree in marketing. He loved his grandfather, but he viewed his life with a mixture of romanticism and deep frustration. He saw the beauty in the handmade bows, but he couldn't understand the business model or the lack of one. For years, he had tried to help. "Grandpa, you need a website. You need an Etsy shop. We could film you working, put it on YouTube. People love this artisan stuff." He had designed a logo for Croft traditional bows, a stylized C with an arrow through it. Silas had looked at the drawing, nodded politely, and then used the piece of paper as a shim to level a workbench leg. It wasn't that he was against technology, he just didn't see the point. His customers found him through word of mouth. He had a backlog of 2 years. He didn't need more work. He needed more time. The problem wasn't demand. The problem was the loan, a reverse mortgage taken out a decade earlier to pay for his wife's cancer treatments. The variable rate had adjusted, the property value had been reassessed downward after 2008, and suddenly the numbers were upside down. The bank, which had been so friendly when it was selling the loan, became an impersonal entity, sending letters filled with cold, legal language. When the foreclosure notice came, Leo was devastated. He tried to reason with the bank. He went to see Mark Jennings himself. He brought one of Silas's bows, a beautiful 66-inch longbow made of Osage orange with a leather-wrapped handle. "Look at this," Leo said, his voice earnest. "This is what he makes. You can't just sell his tools for scrap. This is artistry. This is heritage." Mark Jennings handled the bow with a detached curiosity. He flexed it gingerly. "It's a nice piece of work," he said, handing it back. "I'm sure it is. But the bank isn't in the business of valuing artistry. We're in the business of recovering outstanding debt. The collateral is the property and its contents. We sell the contents at public auction. That's the process. It's the fairest, most transparent way to establish market value." Leo tried again. He used the words he had learned in his marketing classes. "But there's a brand here, a legacy. The Croft name means something to people in this world." Mark Jennings nodded. "And those people are welcome to come to the auction and bid. That's how the market works. If this equipment has special value, the market will recognize it, and the price will reflect that." It was a perfectly logical, perfectly reasonable, and perfectly hollow argument. Leo left the bank feeling like he had run into a wall of glass. He saw the logic, but he knew, with a certainty he couldn't articulate, that it was wrong. The market Mark Jennings believed in so confidently was about to commit a crime of ignorance. It was about to mistake a cathedral for a pile of stones. News of the auction traveled in the slow, quiet way that information moves in communities of practice. It didn't appear in a newspaper or on a major website. It was mentioned on page 14 of the Auctioneer's Weekly Flyer, a cheap newsprint publication filled with listings for farm equipment and estate sales. But someone in that world saw it. A Bowyer in southern Ohio, a man who had once bought a single U stave from Silas 20 years prior, saw the name Silas Croft and the address. He scanned the listing, "Contents of Woodworking Shop." He knew what that meant. He took a picture of the listing with his phone and posted it on a small, private online forum called the Traditional Archers Reend. The forum had only 400 members. It was a place where people argued about the finer points of Horn's knocks and the proper way to apply a beeswax finish. The post was titled simply, "Silas Croft Auction." Within hours, the community was stirring. One name that saw the post was Elias Vance. Elias was 58 years old, a Bowyer from eastern Pennsylvania. He had been making self-bows for 40 years and was one of the few men in the country whose work was spoken of in the same breath as Silas Croft's. The two men had never met, but they knew of each other through the invisible college of their craft. They had corresponded once. In the 1990s, a short exchange of letters about a particularly difficult piece of Pacific yew. Elias Vance read the forum post and felt a cold knot in his stomach. He knew of the Croft workshop. He knew the stories, and he knew, with absolute certainty, what was inside it. He knew about the lathe. The Croft lathe was a legend, a piece of Bowyer folklore. People spoke of it as if it were a mythical object, a machine that could turn wood with an intelligence of its own. Elias looked at the date of the auction. It was in 3 days. He looked up Tinker Creek Road on a map. It was 457 miles away, an 8-hour drive one way. He looked at the listing again. Contents of Woodworking Shop. The phrase was an insult. It was like listing the contents of the Sistine Chapel as used paint and plaster. He called his wife. "I have to go to Virginia," he said. He didn't say why. He didn't need to. She understood his world. He spent that evening getting cash from the bank. Not a lot, but what he could afford. Maybe $2,500. He knew it probably wouldn't be enough if a collector or a speculator got wind of the sale, but he had to try. He wasn't just going to buy a machine. He was going to try and save a piece of history. The next morning, before dawn, he filled a thermos with coffee, put a paper map on the passenger seat of his 12-year-old Dodge Ram pickup, and started driving west. He drove through the rolling hills of Pennsylvania, across the narrow strip of Maryland, and down into the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia. He wasn't thinking about the money. He was thinking about the responsibility of knowledge. He knew what that lathe was. That knowledge created an obligation. The market that Mark Jennings believed in was made up of individuals making decisions. And right now, he was one of those individuals. And he was going to bring his knowledge to that market, a market that otherwise would have none. The day of the auction was clear and cold. The sun was bright but gave no warmth. Cars and trucks were parked up and down the narrow gravel of Tinker Creek Road. The crowd of 70 people was a cross-section of rural life. There were farmers in seed caps looking for a deal on a used tiller, mechanics in greasy coveralls, hoping to pick up a cheap welder, and a handful of antique dealers. Sharp-eyed men and women who could spot a piece of undervalued Americana from 50 yards. They milled around the yard, inspecting the lots, kicking tires on an old John Deere mower, opening and closing the drawers of a rusty tool chest. The auctioneer, a man named Donnie Pyle, stood on a flatbed trailer, his voice a rapid fire, hypnotic chant that echoed off the side of the Crofts' small white house. He was good at his job. He created a sense of urgency, a fear of missing out, that could coax an extra $10 out of a reluctant bidder. Leo had driven his grandfather to the auction. Silas hadn't wanted to come, but Leo insisted. "You should be here," he'd said, though he wasn't sure why. Maybe he just didn't want his grandfather to be alone. Now they stood at the edge of the crowd, watching the slow, methodical dismemberment of a life. Lot by lot, the contents of the house were sold. A set of china for $40, a bedroom suite for $125, a box of old family photographs that nobody bid on, which was added to a box of kitchen utensils that sold for $5. Each sale was a small death. Silas watched without expression, his face as still and weathered as the siding on his workshop. Leo felt a rising tide of shame and anger. He looked at the faces in the crowd. They weren't bad people. They were just looking for a bargain. They saw objects, not stories. They saw a table, not the place where a family had eaten 20,000 meals. They saw a box of tools, not the instruments that had built a home and a life. Mark Jennings was there, of course. He stood near the auctioneer, clipboard in hand, checking off each lot as it was sold. He had a small, satisfied smile on his face. The auction was going well. Prices were meeting or slightly exceeding his estimates. The process was working. The market was efficient. Sometime around 11:30 a.m., a dusty Dodge Ram with Pennsylvania plates pulled off the road and parked half in a ditch. A man got out. He was tall and lean, with graying hair and the same look of quiet competence that Silas Croft had. It was Elias Vance. He walked to the edge of the crowd, his eyes not on the auctioneer, but on the workshop. He saw Silas standing there and recognized him instantly from an old photograph in a book. He gave a slow, respectful nod. Silas, surprised to see a face he almost recognized but couldn't place, nodded back. The connection was made, a silent acknowledgement between two men who shared a language no one else there understood. The auctioneer moved on to the farm equipment. A disc harrow sold for $450, a post-hole digger for $300. Then, Donnie Pyle cleared his throat and looked at his list. "All right, folks. Next up, we got lot number 34. We're going to sell the entire contents of the workshop here. All one money. You get everything inside the building. All the tools, the benches, the lumber, everything. You got till 5 p.m. tomorrow to get it all cleared out. We're selling it as is, where is." He gestured vaguely toward the gray building, plenty of good stuff in there. "Let's start the bidding at $100. Who'll give me 100? A hand went up. A local man who ran a small engine repair shop. "I got 100. Now 2. Who'll give me 200? Another hand. One of the antique dealers. 200. Now 3. Gimme 300. The bidding continued in this way, in increments of 50 and then $25. It was a slow, grudging affair. The bidders were mostly scrap dealers and pickers, calculating the value based on weight of metal and the possibility of a few resaleable hand tools. They had glanced inside the workshop. They saw a mess, a pile of junk. Silas stood motionless, his eyes fixed on the workshop door. Leo watched his grandfather, his heart aching. This was it, the final indignity, the culmination of Mark Jennings' efficient process. The bidding stalled at $475. The auctioneer worked his chant. $475, folks. A whole shop full of tools for $475. Surely it's worth more than that. Who'll give me 500? Silence. The wind rustled the dry leaves in the oak tree overhead. Donnie Pyle was about to drop the gavel. Fair warning, going once. And then a new voice, calm and clear, cut through the chatter. 500. It was Elias Vance. He hadn't raised his hand. He just spoke the number. The auctioneer's head swiveled. $500 from the gentleman in the back. Now 5.25. Who'll give me 525? The local scrap dealer, who had been in the bidding, a man named Gus, shook his head and dropped out. He'd reached his limit. The antique dealer hesitated, then bid $525. Elias Vance came back immediately. 550. His voice was flat, without emotion. The antique dealer looked back at Vance, trying to size him up. He saw a man who looked like he knew what he was doing. This wasn't a casual bid. The dealer figured Vance had seen something he'd missed, and that driving the price up would only cost him more in the end. He shook his head. The auctioneer turned his full attention to Vance. It was clear he was bidding against himself now, against the auctioneer's expectation. I got $550. Let's go for 6. Who'll give me 600? He was looking right at Vance. Vance stared back for a long moment. He didn't bid. He let the silence hang in the air. Then, another man, a local farmer who sometimes bought scrap, raised a finger. $575. He was just trying to push the out-of-toner. Vance didn't flinch. 600. The farmer shrugged and grinned. He was out. The auctioneer scanned the crowd one last time. I've got $600. Going once. Going twice. He paused, locking eyes with Mark Jennings, who gave a slight nod. The price was acceptable. It was above the informal reserve. Sold. For $600 to bidder number 97. The sound of the gavel was like a gunshot in the quiet morning. For a moment, nobody moved. The crowd, which had been focused on the drama of the bidding, let out a collective breath and began to disperse, moving on to the next lot. The transaction was over. The market had spoken. Mark Jennings made a check mark on his clipboard. Lot 34, sold $600. A successful outcome. Leo looked at his grandfather. Silas hadn't moved a muscle, but something in his posture had changed. A tension had gone out of his shoulders. It was over. The worst had happened. The man who had bought the lot, Elias Vance, made his way to the registration table to pay. He didn't immediately go to the workshop. Instead, he walked over to where Silas and Leo were standing. He stopped a few feet away, his hat in his hands. He looked directly at Silas. Mr. Croft, he said. His voice was full of a respect that bordered on reverence. My name is Elias Vance. It's an honor to meet you. Silas looked at him, his eyes slowly focusing on the man's face. He recognized the name. Vance, he said. Pennsylvania. You wrote me about that stave. The one with the compression ripples. Elias Vance smiled, a real smile. You remember. Yes, sir, that's me. That stave made the finest bow I ever built. I still have it. The two men stood in silence for a moment, two kings of a forgotten country. Leo watched them, and for the first time, he began to understand. This wasn't about a sale. This was about a succession. This was about a legacy passing from one set of hands to another. Vance gestured toward the workshop. I came for the lathe, he said quietly, so only Silas and Leo could hear. I couldn't let it go for scrap. He paused. I want you to know, it's going to a good home. It'll keep making bows. Silas nodded slowly. He looked at Elias Vance, and then at his own hands, calloused and stained from 62 years of work. He seemed to find the words he was looking for. The cams on the follower rest, Silas said, his voice raspy. The number 3 cam is for Osage. It likes a slow feed, and you have to watch the tension on the main belt in the winter. It shrinks when it's cold. He wasn't giving advice. He was transferring knowledge. He was handing over the operating manual, a manual that existed only in his head. Elias Vance listened like a student hearing a master. He nodded, absorbing every word. Thank you, he said. I'll remember that. Leo stood by, silent, witnessing an exchange more valuable than anything sold that day. He saw that the true value of the workshop wasn't in the tools themselves, but in the knowledge of how to use them. The market had valued the tools at $600. The knowledge was priceless, and it had just been given away for free. The story should have ended there. The knowledgeable outsider saves the master's tools from the scrap heap. The bank gets its money. Life goes on, but the world is rarely that simple. Elias Vance paid his $600 in cash and got a receipt. He backed his Dodge Ram up to the workshop door. He was a practical man. He knew he couldn't move the entire contents of the shop himself. His plan was to take the lathe, the custom jigs, a few of the irreplaceable hand tools, and as many of the seasoned wood staves as he could fit. The rest he would have to leave behind. He spent the next hour carefully detaching the leather belts from the lathe's motor. He was in the middle of unbolting the headstock when Mark Jennings walked in, carrying his clipboard. Congratulations on your purchase, Mark said, his tone professionally cheerful. Just wanted to remind you that the premises need to be completely cleared by 5 p.m. tomorrow, as per the terms of the sale. Elias Vance wiped his greasy hands on a rag. I know the terms, he said. I'm just taking the important pieces. Mark frowned. I'm afraid that's not how it works. You bought the entire lot. You're responsible for removing everything. If it's not cleared by the deadline, the bank will have to hire a disposal service and bill you for it. He was not being malicious. He was simply enforcing the rules. The rules were designed for efficiency. Selling by the lot was faster than selling by the piece, and it transferred the cost and labor of cleanup to the buyer. Elias looked around the crowded workshop. There were thousands of pounds of wood, metal, and history. It would take 2 men and a much larger truck 2 days to clear it. He had a pickup truck, and he was one man, 457 miles from home. He looked at Mark Jennings' confident, untroubled face. He saw a man who had never built a thing in his life, enforcing a rule that made perfect sense on paper and no sense at all in the real world. This was the tyranny of the system, a system that could not distinguish between a priceless tool and a pile of scrap, a system that created a problem where none existed. Elias Vance was a quiet man, much like Silas. He didn't argue. He just nodded. I understand. He spent the rest of the day carefully disassembling the Croft lathe, wrapping each piece in old blankets he found in the shop. He loaded it, along with the jigs and a box of hand-selected tools, into the bed of his truck. He took as much of the seasoned yew and osage as he could carry. By late afternoon, his truck was full. The workshop was still crowded with benches, shelves, and piles of less precious lumber. It was an impossible task. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the yard, Silas and Leo returned. They hadn't left. They had been sitting in Leo's car down the road, waiting. Silas walked over to Elias Vance. You're not going to get it all, he stated. It wasn't a question. No, sir, I'm not, Elias replied. He looked at the loaded truck and then back at the shop. I got the heart of it, though. That's what matters. Silas nodded. He looked at the benches his father had built, the forge he had learned to use as a boy. He was about to lose the rest of it. Then Leo, who had been quiet all day, spoke up. He addressed Mark Jennings, who was still overseeing the auction cleanup. Excuse me, Leo said. His voice was different now. The pleading tone was gone, replaced by a cool, quiet confidence he had learned just a few hours before, watching 2 old men talk. You sold the contents of the workshop, Lot 34, for $600. That's correct, Mark said, glancing at his clipboard. The transaction is complete. The buyer is Mr. Vance, Leo continued. He is paid in full. Yes, And now, Leo said, looking at Elias Vance, I would like to make Mr. Vance an offer. I will pay him $100 for the remaining contents of the shop, and I will take full responsibility for clearing them from the premises by the deadline. Mark Jennings blinked. He opened his mouth to object, but there was nothing to object to. It was a private transaction between two individuals. The bank was no longer involved. It had sold the assets. What happened to them next was not its concern. Elias Vance looked at the young man. He saw the look in his eyes, the same look of resolve he had seen in his grandfather. He understood. I accept your offer, Elias said. He reached into his pocket and took out the auction receipt. On the back, he wrote, For the sum of $100, I sell the remaining contents of Lot 34 to Leo Croft. Bowyer assumes all responsibility for removal. He signed it and handed it to Leo. Leo took the slip of paper and handed Elias a $100 bill from his own wallet. It was almost all the money he had. Then he turned to Mark Jennings. We'll have it cleared out by 5 tomorrow, he said. It wasn't a request. It was a statement of fact. Mark Jennings stood there for a moment, his efficient system short-circuited by a simple, human transaction he hadn't anticipated. He finally just nodded and walked away. That evening, Leo made a few phone calls. The next morning, a Sunday, 4 pickup trucks and a dozen people from the community showed up. Farmers, neighbors, the man who ran the hardware store. They didn't ask for payment. They spent the entire day helping Leo and Silas move every last bench, every shelf, every scrap of wood out of the workshop and into a neighbor's empty barn for storage. By 4:30 p.m., the workshop was empty. It was just a shell, swept clean. The smell was gone. The soul was gone. But the body of the work, the physical legacy, was saved. Not by the market, but in spite of it. The story of Silas Croft's auction became a quiet legend. Elias Vance took Croft's lathe back to his workshop in Pennsylvania. He reassembled it with the care of a museum curator. The first bow he made on it, he sent to Silas as a gift. It arrived a few months before Silas passed away in his sleep. Silas held the bow, ran his hands over the familiar curve of the limbs, and nodded. The work was continuing. The knowledge had not died. Leo Croft never became a Bowyer. His hands didn't have the patience for it, but he found his own way to carry the legacy. He took the $100 worth of tools and benches he had bought back from his grandfather's life, and he used them to start a small school in the rented barn. He called it the Tinker Creek School of Traditional Craft. He didn't teach people how to make bows. He found old men and women, masters of dying crafts like blacksmithing, coopering, and timber framing, and gave them a place to teach others. He used his marketing skills not to sell objects, but to sell the idea that knowledge, true hands-on knowledge, was worth preserving. The school never made much money, but it was always full. Mark Jennings was promoted a year after the auction. He had exceeded his quarterly goals for asset liquidation. He saw the Croft file as a success story, a non-performing asset resolved with maximum efficiency, and a positive return for the bank's shareholders. He never thought about the old man or the workshop again. It was just a line item on a spreadsheet from years ago. What he never understood, what his system was incapable of understanding, was the difference between price and value. The market had determined the price of Silas Croft's workshop was $600. That was the number of dollars a group of strangers was willing to pay for a pile of objects on a given Saturday. But the value was something else entirely. The value was in the 62 years of practice. It was in the half-century-old U-staves. It was in the custom jigs on a 1938 lathe. It was in the knowledge that you had to tighten a belt in the winter. The market is a tool for discovering price. It is a profoundly poor tool for discovering value. Value is slow. Value is patient. Value is built over generations and is expressed not in dollars, but in the quiet competence of a master's hands. What survives is not always what is most profitable. What survives is what is loved enough to be passed on. The lathe, the heart of the workshop, survived. Not because the market deemed it valuable, but because one man drove 457 miles and another paid $100 he couldn't afford. to defy the market's ignorant verdict.